Hey everybody, this is Dream, and I hope everybody had a good weekend. We have a pretty small little 6-game Major League Baseball slate for the main slate tonight. Before I get started, can you guys smash that like and subscribe button? It helps the channel a lot. Really do appreciate it. So we do have 6 games here, and we have some interesting games. Though all these games have 8 or 8.5 run totals, with the exception of the San Diego Chicago Cubs game, which has a 7-run total. We do have a potential rain issue in Kansas City, but we'll have to wait and see closer to slate lock. Good thing is that game is the first one. And all the other games have relatively clear weather, it looks like, at this point, at least. So let's go ahead and look at this slate from a perspective of pitching. So pitching is kind of rough today. There's not any like huge strikeout guys outside Castillo. And then we have 3 players that are coming off injuries, with Buehler coming off the injury list after a Tommy John surgery, Steele coming off the injury list with a hamstring issue, and then Reagan's just being a little bit banged up after the last game. So we do have some risky plays here from that perspective, but we do have some good options. So we'll start with Castillo for Seattle. He is facing Minnesota. In the last 4 games, he's been really solid. He started the season rough, but he's come up with 4 straight 20 fantasy point games. He's also had 2 30 fantasy point games in that stretch, and he's got the best K rate on the slate by quite a bit. He's had some really solid games strikeout wise, and Minnesota is a team that will strike out decent amounts. So I think he's probably the best play on the slate, but he is a GPP play because he's not a must play, as he does have a little bit lower of a floor than we'd like in this matchup. And there's a couple guys on Minnesota that look decent on the slate. So he's not a must play, but he's definitely one of the better options, which is probably why he's the most expensive player on the slate from a pitching perspective. Looking at Walker Buehler, now he has not pitched in major leagues since 2022 with his Tommy John surgery. So he did have a minor league rehab assignment where he posted a 4.15 with 21 strikeouts and 21 innings. He definitely carries a lot of risk today and he could be on a bit of a limit here. His strikeout rate in the past was good, but he's definitely risky in this one, though. If you were going to have any place to throw him in here, it would be against Miami. They give him some upside as they're a low home run team, and they do strike out a decent amount. And of course, they just traded away their best hitter. So I do think that that's a relatively safe situation, though it is risky because he may be limited. But we'll have to wait and see what they say about how many pitches he'll get potentially, at least. Then we'll look at Steele, who's also coming off the DL. Now, he came off the DL as a result of a hamstring injury. He seems like he's good to go. He did have a tough rehab start, but he looks solid otherwise. His K rate's not great, but it's okay. And he should have a good matchup here against San Diego, which is kind of tough, but not as tough as some of the other options, though he is risky here just to the matchup in general. But he's definitely a GPP kind of risky play. Then we'll look at Reagan's against Milwaukee. Now, Milwaukee's been really solid so far this season, and he has a decent K rate, but it's not great. His last game had to come out due to soreness, but he's been good all season. This matchup is decent for him. It's not great. He's a GPP play, but he's definitely carrying some risk. Then we'll look at Yu Darvish for San Diego. Now, he's facing the Cubs again, which he didn't do well the first time against them this season, but he's done well against them in the past. He's kind of a very boomer bust play. He's definitely highly risky today. He just hasn't had like a bang up game so far this season. He's just had a lot of middle of the road type games and then some bad ones. This is definitely a risky game for him, so he's definitely a GPP, but risky. Looking at Manea for the Mets, he faces St. Louis today, which is kind of tough sometimes, and he looks like he's back on the struggle bus. Not sure that I can trust him right now. He's been inconsistent the last couple of years, and this season he's really struggled since the first 2 games. And I don't really think this is a game that he's going to get back on front from that perspective. So his K rate's pretty low, and he's going to give up more earned runs than some of the other options. But he's definitely in play on the slate simply because there's a lack of good options. And then another good GPP play who I actually like quite a bit today is Andrew Heaney for the Rangers. Now, he will give up some home runs in this game, and Oakland has been hitting home runs, but he may give up like 2, and then Oakland will score 2 runs. And as long as he can get 6 or 7 strikeouts, then we can handle that. And Oakland will strike out a lot as well. So that gives him a lot of potential today. He is a GPP play, But with Oakland being a terrible hitting team, he's going to draw some upside. Now, there's going to be a couple of players on Oakland that's going to have good metrics for a home run. But if he can get around those, or if he can just survive the game, I think he can score in the 15 to 20 point range, which he's done a couple times this season. He definitely carries some risk in this one, but I don't expect Oakland to score a ton of runs. I just expect him to give up one or two, and then that be about it. And if he can get enough strikeouts, he can pay off here. But he's definitely risky on the slate. That's why he's a GPP play. The Hail Mary play today is Woods Richardson from Minnesota. He's been solid in his couple starts, though. They've been against weak teams, and he doesn't face the weakest of teams this time. But it's still a decent play. He's just not a good strikeout guy, so he doesn't have a lot of upside there. But he definitely carries some risk as a result. But he can have a good game here, and this is a matchup that's not absolutely terrible. But there's a couple players on Seattle that I do like, so he's definitely a Hail Mary type of option. Maybe in our catchers, we'll look at the Contrerases first. Now, Milwaukee's Contreras is the best option by quite a bit, and he's been absolutely phenomenal to start the year. He's got 5 home runs already. I look for him to have an opportunity for another one here. But the St. Louis version is also doing pretty well. He's not hitting as high as William is, but Wilson is doing pretty good, and I do like his home run potential in this game. A couple of value plays here. Cal Raleigh, he looks really solid today. He's been a very boom or bust play, but I think he's one of the guys on Seattle that's a good one-off play if you want to go that route. And then if Herrera for St. Louis was to draw a start today, he would be somebody I would consider putting in my lineup because his metrics are off the chart. And then Jonah Heim, also for Texas, looks really solid today at $4,200. Just a good contrarian play, and he's hitting the ball very well lately, which gives him a lot of upside. Looking at first base, we do have a lot of options at this position today. It's a very this slate's going to be high scoring, I think, but it's not going to be because of the pitchers so much. It's going to be the bats, and with Ohtani here, he's just got absolutely phenomenal metrics. He's been hitting the ball extremely well. He's had 3 home runs last 2 games. Did really good against Atlanta, and I look for him to continue that streak here against Miami. But I also like Vinny Pasquantino as a good mid-value play here for the Orioles. He draws really good metrics for this game, and he's been pretty solid so far this season as a fantasy output guy. But Freddie Freeman and Paul Goldschmidt are both contrarian plays that you could go off of Ohtani, and then 2 value plays that you could consider. Rice Hoskins from Milwaukee, he looks pretty decent today from a metrics perspective, as does Alex Kirilloff from Minnesota. He's a good one-off for Minnesota if you want to go that route, or if you wanted to stack up Minnesota against that pitcher in Castillo, which could be a tricky play today, but is doable. Kirilloff would be a guy that I would lead off from that perspective. He can also play in the outfield. Looking at second base, we do like Mookie Betts a ton today. He's very expensive. Going to be hard to roster, but he's definitely drawing some good upside on this one. Marcus Semien is also in a good place for Texas. He's also been pretty decent recently, which really given him some upside here. But we are probably going to try to pay down at this position, and a couple different ways you could do that. One being Edward Julian from Minnesota. Now, this is definitely the contrarian play, but he's a little bit cheaper than the other guys I mentioned. He's had some good home runs this season. I also like Polanco for Seattle. He looks like he's in a really solid spot now. He's been inconsistent throughout the year, but he's recently had a nice string of good games, and he's hitting really well right this moment. So definitely somebody to consider. Bogarts for San Diego is a good one-off for San Diego today, as he does draw good metrics for this game. And then Michael Massey is a good cheap play for Kansas City. And he looks like a really solid play here at second base. I think this is a position you can definitely pay down a little bit more and kind of pay up at other places. Looking at third base, this position is probably my least favorite on the slate because it's just kind of risky top to bottom. But Nolan Arenado does draw good metrics here, but they're not great. This is definitely an avoidable position for this. I'm actually probably going to try to pay down here and just try to make some Hail Mary plays. And one of those would be Furman for St. Louis. If he draws a start today, which it looks like he might again, as he's been playing the last few games, he's going to have some potential with this $2,100 price tag, and I do like him a lot here. But at third base, otherwise, you could look at Miguel Garcia for Kansas City or Manny Machado. But again, I don't really love anybody at this position. But some other value plays. Brett Baty for the Mets actually does jump off the page today with good metrics, and so does Josh Rojas for Seattle in a pretty good matchup. And he's been hitting the ball very well so far when he draws starts. So he's definitely somebody that's in play at this position. Looking at shortstop, this is a pretty expensive position, but we do have some value plays. Obviously, with Bobby Witt and Mookie Betts, they both have a lot of potential today. Mookie and Bobby have both been extremely good so far this season. Lindor is a good one-off off of them for the Mets, but he's definitely risky as he's not hit the ball very well. But the last 3 or 4 games, he's been phenomenal. And then Willie Adames is a good value play here for the Milwaukee Brewers. He's been one of the more consistent players for Milwaukee this season. And I also like Kim from San Diego here for in this matchup. He's been inconsistent, but he does have good metrics in certain situations, and this is one of them. And then Willie Castro, excuse me, from the Minnesota Twins. If you like the twin stack, or if you want to go with a one-off from them, then he's also not a bad way to go, and he's cheap. Looking at outfielders, outfield is actually one of the weakest positions for this slate, which is pretty wild. But Ohtani, obviously the top overall guy, as he could play first base as well. But Tatis Jr. also looks really solid today for San Diego. If you like San Diego today, then he'd be somebody I would consider in this matchup. But then we got some good value plays here. We'll look at Ruiz for Oakland. If he draws a start, he definitely has that home run potential. And I do say that you could use him and use Heaney as well if you wanted. But we'll have to wait and see to get him in the lineup as he has been day to day. Looking at Nemo, he's very inconsistent so far this season, but he has improved recently, and so I do think he's got some good potential in this one, and he's a good one-off for the Mets. MJ Melendez looks really solid for Kansas City. I do like his upside today, despite the fact that he's not hit the ball particularly well this season. He does have a lot of potential in this one. Then I also like Starling Marte. He's been jumping off the page lately a lot, and he really hadn't done a ton with it, but he has had some good fantasy point games, and so I do think he's a viable option, though he's a little bit pricier than I'd like. Dylan Carlson for St. Louis jumps off the page as a cheap play today. If he draws a start, he'll be somebody I would consider on this one. He did play the last game for the first time in a while. He didn't get a hit, but I do think he's going to have some opportunity today. And then Alex Kirilloff can also play at this position as well. And let's see, for the outfield as first base. Some odds here would be Max Kepler, Trevor Larnach. I also like Luke Raley here for Seattle. I also like Churio for Milwaukee, and then Outman for the LA Dodgers. Now, if we look at the sub 3,000 guys, Furman, who I mentioned at third base for St. Louis, looks really solid today. I also like Carlson in outfield, who I mentioned, and Luke Raley in the outfield for Seattle. Brett Beatty at third base. At third base for the Mets looks decent, and then Esbel for Kansas City in outfield, and then Duran, who can play first or third base for Texas. It's just $2,700, kind of a Hail Mary plays there, but it looks really solid. So let's go ahead and look at our stacks today. We do have some fun stacks, with the Dodgers stack being pretty expensive at the top, but you've got 2 cheap plays that can help offset it, and you can go cheap at the pitcher to get that stack in there. Looking at Kansas City, I think the stack is really solid. It looks really good, but I think Pasquinto, Melendez, and Massey, and then Isbel, and then go with one of either Witt Jr., Perez, or Garcia, depending on who you like the most. For Texas, Simeon, Garcia, Duran, Heim, and Seager. This is going to get a boost to the righties, and so this is definitely a good way to go. For Seattle, Raleigh, Polanco, Rayleigh, Rojas, and France. This is a pretty cheap stack, and so it's definitely a really nice stack to go, and you can pay up at pitching if you want. Looking at St. Louis, Furman, Goldschmidt, Contreras, Carlson, and Herrera. I do think it's not terrible to leave out Arenado, but if one of the guys were to not be in the lineup like Herrera or Furman, then you could sneak in Arenado there. For Milwaukee, Contreras, Hoskins, Adames, Churio, and Sanchez. This is a pretty sneaky stack today. I think it's going to be fun. For the Mets, this is high risk, high reward, but Nemo, Alonso, Marte, Lindor, Batty, and McNeil. There's a lot of different ways you can run that one. For Minnesota, this is a risky stack, but it definitely is cheap with Kirilloff, Julian, Kepler, Larnach, and Castro. For Oakland, this is a stack that I do like when it comes to having a couple of the guys hit home runs, but it's risky because it's going to be a tough matchup for them to score more than a couple. Ruiz, Toro, Brooker, Nevin, and J.D. Davis. Looking at the Cubs, Horner, Hop, Morel, Bush, and Crow Armstrong. For San Diego, Tatis Jr., Bogarts, Machado, Kim, and Campusino. And then for Miami, Chisholm, De La Cruz, Bell, Gordon, and Sanchez. So there's a lot of decent stacks today. I think it's going to be a high-scoring slate, but there's nobody that I really just had to jump off the page and love. So I think it's going to be, you're going to want to try to do stacks today and just try to do some variations of things and then paying around based on what you need pitching and, outside the stacks, your one-off guys. So